Welcome everyone to Landscaping at the Water's Edge, an ecological approach. This is one of the webinars we're offering in our series, A Focus on Sustainability. This webinar series was developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education. By working together, the webinar series enables us to expand the reach of our individual programs. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're all nonprofit and largely volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, ELA, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, CCLC, the Midwest Ecological Landscape Alliance, MELA, and EcoLandscape California, ELC. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Catherine Neal, Extension Professor and Specialist in Landscape Horticulture at the University of New Hampshire. Dr. Neal develops and conducts training in sustainable landscape practices that enhance biodiversity and protect our soil and water resources. Her areas of expertise include rain garden design and installation, pollinator habitat, and meadow establishment strategies for New England. She's the author of several fact sheets and books, including Landscaping at the Water's Edge, which is available online through the University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension. Welcome, Dr. Neal. We're eager to learn more about landscapes at the water's edge and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Penny. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Surface water quality is an important issue facing many of our states and regions today, and we all share a responsibility for protecting and improving our water resources. Concerns over landscape practices and their potential impact on water quality resulted in UNH Cooperative Extension developing this training program and a manual called Landscaping at the Water's Edge, which serves as the basis for today's presentation. Because we all live in a watershed, whether we own shoreland property or not, and all of our actions impact water quality somewhere downstream. So watershed is a term that we use to describe the area of land that drains water into a particular stream, river, or lake. In other words, it's the land over and through which water flows on its way downhill to the nearest water body. And we usually name watersheds by the name of the receiving water body, such as Winnipesaukee, which is our largest lake here in New Hampshire. If we look at this diagram of a watershed, we can see that any water falling within this thick white line here is part of the water flow that's going to end up downstream into this larger water body down here. All of the water falling outside of the white boundary then flows to a different destination, and hence that land would be in a different watershed. So the peaks of hills and mountains or ridges often mark the dividing line between adjacent watersheds. But all land area belongs to one watershed or another, or even more than one watershed, because small watersheds can join to form larger watersheds and reach larger water bodies. So the impacts of your actions on land can have long-reaching consequences. New England watersheds tend to be relatively small in extent as well as steep in topography. Here we see a GIS image of the Lake Winnipesaukee watershed delineated by the thin black line around the lake. And you can see that even our largest lake has a relatively small area of land that contributes water from rain and snow melt runoff. This means that all activities within the watershed, and not just the people who own the shore land properties, have the potential to deliver nutrients and other pollutants to the lake. Here's another example of a fairly small land area that drains to a fairly large water body, Spruce Creek over in southwestern Maine, which then merges with the Piscataqua River and drains into the Atlantic Ocean. So an easy way to find information on your own watershed is through the EPA.gov website and go to their watershed page, and you can type in your zip code here, and it will bring up all kinds of information about your watershed. It will give you a map. It will talk about the water quality impairments and citizen efforts and regulatory efforts to improve water quality within that watershed. This diagram of the water cycle is meant to remind you of the essential natural processes by which water is recycled continuously through time. So even water that infiltrates into the ground is connected eventually with water bodies such as wetlands, oceans, and so forth. But infiltration through soil and through the ground is one of the best cleansing mechanisms available for polluted water. Any water that falls from precipitation or melts from snow upslope, if it doesn't have the opportunity to infiltrate, finds its way downhill, because water runs downhill, into runoff streams and into lakes, streams, ponds, water bodies, and so forth, which all merge together eventually and end up in some point entering into the ocean. The problem with runoff water is that it carries a lot of things along with it into that receiving water body, such as nutrients that may be coming from farm operations and manures, may be coming from application to agricultural lands and landscapes. It may be carrying contaminants from septic leakage, and even though that flow might be a little bit underground, it still could flow and join into the runoff water at the end. And of course, urban runoff is also a large source of contaminants such as oil and volatile organic compounds. If we can interrupt this runoff flow with vegetation to slow down that flow as it goes downhill and allow that water to infiltrate, that is an excellent way to help prevent the degradation of the water bodies. In a natural system such as what you see on the left here, about half of the precipitation that falls onto that land area would be expected to infiltrate through the soil, and eventually it will recharge groundwater as well. And because of large storm events and when the infiltration capacity of the soil is exceeded by the amount of precipitation landing on the soil, you might get about 10% surface water runoff from that scenario. Whereas on the right side, where we've developed and replaced that vegetated area with impervious surfaces, pavements and rooftops and so forth, our percentages are about reversed, with the majority of the water being subject to runoff, which means it's going to end up in our surface water bodies, and only about the opportunity for about 15% infiltration. Now, you probably noticed that these numbers don't add up to 100% in either scenario, and that's because the rest of the water is retained somehow on site and or subject to evaporation or transpiration. Why is this a problem? Especially with the impervious surfaces, we're reducing the amount of infiltration and recharge of groundwater, which in some areas is a real problem. If you use that groundwater for supplying drinking water to large urban areas, for example. But more impervious surface also leads to more water running into rivers and streams at a faster pace. So this flashier runoff program can cause temporary flooding. It can cause more erosion of stream banks, lake sides, and so forth, and unprotected soil. And it carries more sediment into our water bodies as well. And sediment itself is considered a pollutant and a threat to water quality. What we do to the land or on the land then has a large impact on the water body, because as we develop land, we are doing these things that work against us. One is we want to have those clear views of the lakes and water bodies, and so we end up doing a lot of removal of trees and shrubs, not just for the view, but to provide areas to build. In the process, we're increasing impervious surface, even if we're only building a house and a driveway and a patio. That's all impervious surface, and it reduces the amount of land area that water can infiltrate through. As we're working on these areas, we're compacting soil and we're removing vegetative cover, which subjects the soil to erosion. And normally in the process of development, we're going to have an increased amount of fertilizers and pesticides applied to those lands. This is a nice scenario from Wisconsin that shows the difference between this lot, which is basically a forested lot on a gentle slope with soil down to the lake, and before development, it might, in a growing season, be expected to contribute about 1,000 cubic feet of runoff into the lake with a little bit of phosphorus going with it and about 5 pounds of sediment. The same lot, once we remove most of those trees, add a reasonable sized home, a lawn area, paved driveway, and so forth, is going to increase the loading to the lake by about 5 times for runoff, 7 times for phosphorus, and 18 times for the amount of sediment that gets to the lake. Now be aware that this model is based on a 1990s development scenario in Wisconsin and will vary with hydrology, topography, etc. And also I want to stop here and point out that many states and locales now have regulations or guidelines for minimum setbacks, limits to the amount of impervious surface that can be put into a lot, the amount of trees that can be removed, etc. So there's a lot of limitations on development that help in regards to protecting our vegetated areas and protecting water quality. But those regulations and rules vary from place to place, and so you really need to check your local and state regulations when you're working on these shoreline properties and find out what you can and cannot do, what the limitations are, what requires permitting, etc. And the place usually to start with would be your state's Department of Environmental Services or equivalent. So consider what happens then when we not only have one lot that's being developed, but that we carve up the landscape in a watershed, replacing those natural vegetated areas with many developed lots, and even creating efficient transport pathways to the receiving waters by building roads and putting in storm drains and so on and so forth. Those impacts are multiplied many-fold. There are very good economic reasons to protect our shorelands and water quality as well. A UNH study about 10 years ago showed that water quality was very much tied into home sales, and that the value of the property generally was correlated with a loss in water clarity of 3 feet as measured by a Secchi dish would reduce the property value by 10 to 20%. So that's quite a bit of direct impact to the property owner. And then, of course, the home values determine what the tax base for the town is, and of course recreation is a huge factor in terms of the value of what our water is worth. In this part of the country, at least, reduction in water clarity is usually associated with either sedimentation, as shown in this slide in Great Bay, which is near here and drains into the Atlantic Ocean, or a result of algae growth as a result of nutrient loading to the water body. Sediments are bad because they shade out bottom plants, they reduce the oxygen in the water, and they can directly damage the gills of aquatic organisms and smother spawning areas and immobile organisms, and therefore are very disruptive to the entire aquatic ecosystem, especially in this near-shore environment called the littoral zone, which is extremely important to a large number of species, mammals, reptiles, fish, and so forth, in order to complete their life cycle. They may not spend their entire life cycle there, but this water's edge environment is part of what they require to live a normal life. So let's talk a little bit about nutrients and how that impacts water quality, and then we'll be talking about specific ways we can reduce the risk to water quality through proper landscape practices. When we talk about nutrients impacting water quality, we're primarily concerned with two common fertilizer ingredients that you're familiar with. One is nitrogen and one is phosphorus. And I start with phosphorus because that's the one that is usually limiting in freshwater bodies. So lakes, streams, rivers, and so forth, as opposed to estuaries, bays, oceans, and so forth. And so when we add phosphorus to those water bodies, it's like fertilizing the water. You end up getting blooms of algae and submerged plants and so forth that then cut the sunlight penetration down so that there are fewer things down below that are able to live, especially plants that require sunlight to photosynthesize. And also the algae takes up so much of the oxygen in the water that we end up with fish kills and so forth when all that vegetative material dies and decomposes. Another thing you need to think about with phosphorus is it tends to be sticky. In other words, it tends to attach itself to soil particles. So the primary way that it's getting into the water body is by being transported with that sediment or soil particles that are going into the water body itself. And nobody wants to live on a green lake or a green pond. The other nutrient of concern is nitrogen, and this is more of a concern because it's the limiting nutrient in marine systems and estuaries, so that adding nitrogen results there in the growth of algae and so forth, as opposed to phosphorus, which usually is at higher concentrations in those water bodies. Nitrogen is very dynamic in the environment and in the soil. It's converted very rapidly and easily by microbes and chemical processes into alternate forms. Many of these forms are very soluble, and therefore they're mobile and go where the water goes. And so if we're infiltrating water down through the soil, then nitrogen stands the chance of going with that into groundwater, which is a totally different problem than what we're talking about today. But if it's going into runoff water into water bodies, then it can be a contaminant there too. So it's not like phosphorus where it's stuck to soil particles. This one is going with the water itself. And some of the forms that nitrogen is going to be found in the environment, nitrate and ammonia, which are the forms that plants can use, as well as nitrate, can be directly toxic to aquatic organisms, so that's not good. And I just wanted to add that it really doesn't matter whether the nitrogen originated in a synthetic or an organic form in terms of what it does eventually in terms of water quality. Because once nitrogen is broken down and transformed into these forms that are actively moved and active in the environment, it doesn't matter whether it came from an organic molecule or not. That's not to say there's not an advantage of organic or synthetic slow-release forms of nitrogen, which will only release a small amount at any one particular time, so that if we have a large precipitation event, it can only carry what is soluble at the time. This is just a really good visual to see some evidence that phosphorus really is the primary limiting nutrient in lakes. And this was a lake up in Ontario where apparently they got permission to build this artificial dam across it, and then only carbon and nitrogen were allowed to be used on this end of the lake up here, where you see nice, pretty blue water after the fact. And down at this end of the lake, there was also phosphorus being added to it, so that we do see that directly caused an algae bloom and water quality degradation. So landscaping is often associated with increased application of nutrients to lawns and landscapes, as well as agriculture. But because landscaping is more prevalent in shoreland property areas, it's often blamed for the problem of algae blooms, water quality degradation, sedimentation, etc. So we're going to pause here for a couple minutes and check in with Penny and see if there have been any questions that come in. But when we come back, we're going to take a different approach and explore not what you can't do as a landscaper, but what you can do through proper and appropriate design and maintenance practices to minimize the impacts and in some cases even improve the water quality through our landscape practices.
We do have two questions, Catherine. The first one is, do you recommend berms at the shoreline to slow runoff and increase infiltration?
Okay, and the first answer is we are going to be talking quite a bit about vegetative buffers at the shoreline to do those things, as opposed to berms. And berms will help slow the water as it approaches there and will increase infiltration. However, I think in most of our shoreline protection laws, you're not allowed to do any alteration of terrain right at the water's edge. So that would be a local regulatory thing you would want to check on.
Okay, and the second question is also about infiltration, and it sounds like you're going to address that in the next segment. So I think we're all set for now. Wait, one other question has just come in. Do you have a reference for the statistics that you showed for measuring economic value of waterways?
Yes, that is a publication that was published by our UNH Lakes Monitoring Program, and if you go to extension.unh.edu, and I'll show that web address at the end of the talk, and just search for economic value of lakes or something like that, that should bring that document up. And if you can't find it, I'd be glad to find it for you, and I will give you my email address at the end of this presentation as well.
Okay. I don't see any other questions, so thank you for those responses, and we can continue on.
All right. But you like this picture, right? Hopefully that's not the way we are doing things anymore. Because really we want to be, as landscapers, perceived to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And I think that is very much the trend these days. So let's talk about what we can do to protect and improve water quality. Probably the single most critical improvement that a shoreline property owner can make is to either maintain or reestablish a vegetative buffer area with many layers of plants in it that slows down that runoff water as it approaches the lake and allows it to infiltrate. And in the process, a lot of the contaminants are going to be absorbed or filtered out through either the soil itself or through the plant roots before it reaches the lake. So this is number one on my list of important things that we can do. And this one really is for shoreline property owners because the vegetative buffer upland isn't going to be nearly as effective. So the benefits of shoreline buffers are certainly that it protects directly the banks and the soils from erosion because you've got this network of roots now that are holding the soil in place. What we just talked about, intercepting and allowing surface water to infiltrate rather than running off into the lake. Filtering sediment as well as the nutrients and soluble contaminants and so forth in the water during the infiltration process. Just the fact that water has to find its way down through this matrix of plant roots and stems and leaves and so forth is going to slow it down and stop a lot of that sediment along the way. And the fourth function that we haven't really talked too much about and won't spend a lot of time is that, again, this water's edge environment is absolutely critical to wildlife habitat. And maybe this is what resonates with a lot of our potential customers rather than just the water quality aspect of things. The buffer does not have to block the view to the water to be effective. And I think this is the primary barrier or obstacle that we encounter when we start talking about vegetative buffers, is people don't want to lose their view. You can't blame them. They pay good money to buy these shoreline properties and enjoy the wonderful views of the lake or other water body. But again, a nice landscape design can actually enhance the view, where we can edit the view that is already there and still allow plenty of view shed and also access to the water without having a totally open landscape from the house to the lake itself. How wide the buffer needs to be, it really depends on a lot of things, including what the function of that buffer is. There are a lot of different references available for determining minimum buffer width. This is just one from U.S. Forest Service and Chesapeake Bay program that shows that probably 50 feet is pretty minimal in terms of doing anything beyond modifying water temperature, which is good for the organisms in that environment, and stabilizing the bank and aquatic food web in the aquatic zone. But when we talk about removal of nutrients or even prevention of sedimentation or flood mitigation and so forth, we probably have to get up into the 100-foot or even 150-foot range. And the steeper the slope to the lake is, the faster that water is being shed, and so the wider the buffer needs to be in order to fulfill those functions. However, at least here in New Hampshire, most shoreline properties do not have that much buffer to work with. And so we would consider probably 25 feet as being the minimum for doing any good in terms of filtering pollutants. And 75 feet would be recommended certainly on slopes probably more than 60% and so forth. But again, if you don't have that much, does it mean you shouldn't put a buffer in? No, it means you need to really put an intensive buffer in with lots of layers of plants and a very densely vegetated buffer. And we like to tell people that really any buffer is better than none, because it's going to provide at least partial function. But maybe that's not true. As in this example here, this homeowner probably thought they were doing a good thing by putting in this 3-foot wide buffer strip right along the waterway and planting a few shrubs in it. And probably it's actually not doing any good at all. Perhaps the only thing that it might help do is prevent fertilizer from being thrown directly into the water if they're applying it with a broadcast spreader on the lawn itself. So let's talk about what goes into the buffer. And we don't just want, one row of light shrubs or one group of perennials or something like that. We'd really like to mix vegetation types and make them very dense and make them layered, because the more vegetation that we can pack into that zone, the more functionality we're going to get. So we want to create a very dense root mat. So we want to create dense vegetation above the soil, yes, but also remember that all these plants have different root characteristics, and some are going to be very deep-rooted and some are going to be very wide-rooted and so forth. And by creating this diverse, dense root mat, we can really stabilize the soil and hold it there, protect it against erosion. So that's a wonderful function of dense vegetation. The living and the dead organic matter in the soil complex then also creates a sponge, and that sponge absorbs and holds large quantities of water, which are then available for the roots to take up and the plants to pump up through their system and release back to the atmosphere, which is the process known as transpiration. In addition, we're increasing the amount of evaporation from the soil surface by holding more water there for a longer period of time. In the process of infiltration and transpiration as well, plants are removing and using many nutrients, and whether those nutrients came from fertilizers, from animal waste, from organic matter, from sewage, wastewater, soil erosion, or whatever, it's an excellent way to make use of those nutrients to support the vegetative layer instead of putting them into the lake where they are too much. Other pollutants such as petroleum products, road salt, heavy metals, pesticides are also filtered by passing through the litter layer that we would allow to build up here and through the soil profile where they can be absorbed by soil particles. Many of those things will be stick to soil particles temporarily and or be broken down by microorganisms. So there's a time factor there that will improve cleanup of those things as well. So plants also reduce the force and slow the flow of water as well as precipitation. So by planting in layers, the raindrops as they're falling through the vegetation are going to have to be hitting and passing through many layers. And at each layer that they're hitting, they're breaking up into smaller and smaller raindrops. So by the time they hit the soil, much of the energy has been dissipated and we don't get nearly as much erosion in those systems as we do in unvegetated or minimally vegetated areas. So the drawing on the left is a natural system, and this is how nature in this area of the country might design these systems. And as a landscape designer, perhaps we look to nature and try to mimic those systems, such as in the landscape planting on the right, where we again have those layers of vegetation, and we plan to have a dense planted area that knits together, and therefore we don't need to worry about keeping the soil heavily mulched, and we're going to allow those leaves to fall and to build up that litter layer as well. So you could think of your entire property as a buffer system subdivided into these zones, starting with the aquatic zone, the shoreline zone, a lowland transition zone, and the upland zone. And each one of these zones would have different light, soil, and moisture characteristics that determine the appropriate plants that could be added to those zones. As landscapers, we don't work too much with the aquatic plants, but they're certainly critical to maintaining that healthy littoral zone. I'm going to kind of skip over this slide, but I suggest contacting your local lakes authorities as far as planting regulations and recommendations if you're actually thinking about doing any aquatic plant addition, as permits are usually required, and there's much concern and sensitivity about aquatic invasives as well. But they are very important parts of the ecosystem and the vegetated buffer, and we don't want to discourage the plants that are naturally growing there unless they are invasives. And so one of the worst things that a homeowner might decide to do is to clean all that stuff out. Maybe you can discourage that. The shoreline zone would be where plants have consistently wet soils to deal with, and some of the native plants in our area that thrive there that we could mimic in our plantings would be willows, red twig dogwood, winterberry, summer sweet, and many grasses, ferns, and sedges. And if you need a little perennial planting there, something like blue flag iris, marsh marigold, and so forth, are going to be those plants that are very tolerant of those conditions. If you go back several feet from the water's edge then, and you have an area where it may be flooded briefly in the spring or after a heavy rainfall or so forth, but then it dries out in between, that would be our transition zone. And good choices here would include things like blueberry, both high bush and low bush, serviceberry, cranberry bush viburnum, swamp azalea, asters, turtlehead, joe pye weed, and selected grasses and ferns as well. So you can see we have a number of plants that we do work with as landscapers that we can put into these vegetative buffer areas. And then upland would generally be the area surrounding the home or the building on the property. It's rarely wet for long, and it may get very dry depending on the soils. Native trees in our upland zones here might be things like birches, beech, oak, pine, hemlock, fir, and spruce species, and we would encourage people to again, look to nature and be inspired by what you find there. There's also a huge variety of shrubs, perennials, and ground covers that can be used here. And some of these may even require irrigation. And this may be the appropriate place for more intensively managed landscape area, garden bed, and so forth, even if it does require irrigation, more fertilizer, pruning, and maintenance care, because now we're talking about being upland to the point where any water that does run off from this area will be intercepted by these other zones of vegetation on its way down to the lake. So by now I hope you've keyed into these keywords, vegetate and infiltrate, and if they're the only two things you remember from this seminar, I think I will have done my job. But vegetative buffers are just one of many landscape techniques that we can use to divert and slow down water movement and prevent soil erosion and runoff and so forth. And these line drawings I'm showing you are actually photos from our book, and I don't have time to go through all these practices. But the strategies that most of these rely upon, and these are all low-tech techniques that we can incorporate into almost any landscape plan, whether it's a new installation or a renovation. So the first strategy is to detain or hold back the water to slow down the flow. Second one is diversion, prevent the water from traveling over problematic areas. So instead of letting it travel down your paved driveway right into the water or down the pathway into the lake, then divert it to go to a vegetated area. Flow spreading means instead of having a narrow channelized flow of water, to spread that over a wider area so it has a greater chance to infiltrate and slow down. We've already talked about the importance of infiltration and plant absorption and transpiration. So we're going to run very briefly just through a few examples of ways to adopt these strategies, and most of these are available online through many different resources in terms of the actual proper construction and design techniques for them. The first one is infiltration trenches. And in New Hampshire, because we have a lot of snow and ice, and that causes problem with gutters, a lot of homes simply don't have gutters, or they're just not very functional, and we get a lot of runoff dripping right from the roofs along the sides of the houses, and this can be very substantial amounts and also very damaging, or even end up in the basement. So a properly constructed infiltration trench can be used to collect that runoff and allow it to infiltrate into the ground by having our sand and gravel base here to allow infiltration and sloping it properly so that it's not going to be in the basement instead. The same concept can be used along something like a road or a driveway if appropriate. Plunge pools are small excavations filled with stone that minimize erosion, slow down the flow, capture sediment, and allow for some infiltration of water right there. Usually it's a point source where we're collecting the water from pipes like drains coming off the gutters or sump pumps or so forth. On the right is a larger version of a plunge pool, and this one's at the top of a drainage trench that's lined by stone. And here we're capturing water from upslope that's diverted by this rubber razor right here. So it's coming from this direction and is diverted over to here where we're getting a lot of infiltration right there, and what doesn't infiltrate can then be shunted down the ditch there, the stone, instead of flowing down the hardscape. Rain barrels are quite popular and very appropriate in many areas of the country, especially where we don't get an awful lot of rain. Here I would say they're really limited by the capacity of the rain barrel, because when we get a lot of rain, we get a lot of rain, and the rain barrels fill up very, very quickly, and we don't need the water at that point for irrigation. So while it's a nice concept that you can catch water from your rooftop and so forth into these rain barrels and store them and reuse it for irrigation, it's great. It just is going to be more appropriate where perhaps water is limiting, and or if you can disconnect from a potable source for irrigation and use this water that's captured from rain, that's great. However, we do use a lot of rain gardens. Rain gardens are a big thing here, as I'm sure they are in many parts of the country. I think they have a lot of advantages. One is they can look really nice, and somebody might not even know it's a stormwater management practice. Two is that you can do a lot with a fairly small amount of space and a low-tech installation, such as on this residential rain garden here. And all a rain garden is a area that's sculpted to be lower in the center, so the water is flowing into the rain garden either from surrounding slopes, or you can capture water from a gutter, for example, and pipe it to the rain garden. And then it temporarily ponds in the rain garden until it is allowed or has time to infiltrate into the soil. Now the key here is that the water should only pond there for a day or 2 days at the most, and that you have to have soil which allows a good enough infiltration or percolation rate that that water will drain away, so that you don't support mosquitoes or end up with a wet land instead of a garden. And so you do need to do a perk test and site your rain garden properly in order to construct it and get the most effect out of it. And typical cost for residential rain garden would be about $11 to $13 a square foot. There are also biofiltration rain gardens, which are engineered systems where the soil has been largely excavated and replaced with a matrix of gravel and sand and loam. And this rain garden here, which is in our downtown Durham, is collecting so much runoff that the infiltration during a heavy storm is over 32 inches of water an hour goes through that system. So think that those plants definitely need some real tolerance of extremely wet conditions and also extremely dry conditions, because if it doesn't rain for weeks on end, these soil matrices get very, very hot, and in addition, we're in a real heat island effect there. Ironically, I guess, but maybe not so much, prairie grasses and meadow plants seem to do quite well in these high infiltration, biofiltration areas. And so you see here Joe Pieweed and black-eyed Susan and some ornamental grasses. And then on the right, this is a different one, but I've been most impressed with blue-flag iris and false blue indigo for their ability to tolerate those conditions and come back year after year. Here you see a series of water bars along a sloped path to the shoreland, and they slow the flow of runoff water as it's going down towards the lake and divert it off into the lawn or other vegetated areas where it can infiltrate. The distance to put between bars is determined by the slope of the land, and there are references to guide you in terms of spacing. Similar to water bars, but closer together, infiltration steps are basically pervious steps. So they're framed up and then filled in with a forest gravel or mulch type of a matrix. And another thing you see here is that we have a curved pathway going down to the lake instead of a straight pathway. So another very simple technique that can be used to get the water off the pathway to the lake and into the vegetated areas. So think for just a minute about this problem area here and visualize what you might do with it based on some of the techniques that we have just talked about. And I know we're running a little bit close on time, so I'm going to go ahead and show you what was done. This was not a project I had anything to do with, so for better or worse. But it does show nicely a lot of application of the techniques that we covered, including infiltration steps, meandering or curved pathways, addition of vegetation, use of pervious surface or gravel on the walkway. And I'd like to just wrap this up by showing you a series of 4 drawings, and I want to credit my friend Lauren Chase Rowell, who did the illustrations for our book. And it illustrates the conversion of this degraded shoreline lot into a beautiful and ecological landscape which manages stormwater on site using a variety of strategies. So here we're starting with maybe something that isn't untypical or atypical if this lot was developed back in the 50s or 60s or 70s when people got very interested in owning shoreland property. Landscape improvement begins by planting a vegetative buffer, number 1 thing to do. Protect the shoreland, restore the plantings at the water's edge, and start to rethink the use of the lawn and how much lawn really needs to be there, and allow the rest of it to start to grow up into a more natural or meadow-like condition. Think about replacing some impervious surface with pervious surfaces as well. And while you're at it, think about whether you need all those docks and piers that you have out there, or whether just a smaller dock, which would reduce maintenance as well, will still allow a very usable lakeshore. So then as those aquatic and shoreline plants become established, the shore is protected against erosion and important habitat is reestablished. The larger lawn area here is maintained for recreation and the smaller one for relaxation. So we're starting to develop that outdoor room concept here. Meadows keep the view open. Yes, meadows do need some maintenance, and especially getting started may not be the easiest thing to do. But we continue to add native vegetation as well for more function and more wildlife habitat. And what we end up with in this plan, at least, is the ultimate series of outdoor rooms that serves multiple functions and provides many, many ecosystem services, not the least of which is stormwater management. So I would like to just acknowledge the many other people who contributed slides to this presentation and were involved in developing our manual or book, which is available at this web address at the top of your screen. And you can look at it online. You can even print it if you want to print 100 pages, or you can purchase it for $20. And what I've presented today is the foundation, actually, for a 2-day workshop that we offer for landscapers, property owners, conservation groups, and anyone else with an interest in landscapes and water quality. So it's truly a very abbreviated presentation of landscaping at the water's edge. And I'm going to come right back to this slide, but I just want to show you one more resource here that I just discovered really this morning. And this is a clearinghouse that EPA has up in terms of finding information on lakeshore protection and restoration. And if you were to scroll down this page, you would find many, 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 many resources, books, fact sheets, diagrams, and so forth, including, I was pleased to find our book listed on this website as well. So that's another good reference that you will want to check out later. So at this point, I'm finished with the presentation. Penny, are there any more questions?
Yes, Catherine, we have several questions that have come in. The first is, what is the brand or model of the green square rain barrel that you showed on the right-hand side of that slide with the rain barrels?
Mm-hmm. The answer to that is I don't have the slightest idea. I'm sorry. And that is not my picture, so it would be really hard for me to find that information.
All right, we will try to research that and forward that information along to the questioner. The next question is, in areas along a shoreline that become compacted, is regular aeration recommended?
So if you have an area that's becoming compacted along the shoreline, I guess you need to know why it's becoming compacted. And Typically, it would be from traffic, either from foot traffic or vehicular traffic. So the first thing to address would be, is there some other way you can handle that traffic, or replace just a bare soil with some kind of a mulch layer, which will also help protect against compaction, or perhaps infiltration steps if it's on a slope or something like that. If it's actually lawn area, that's probably the only time that we would recommend aeration. And typically we are no longer encouraging or allowing new lawns, at least, to be developed all the way down to the shoreline. We probably would not, be able to aerate a vegetative buffer just because of all the different layers and plants that are there. You'd never have the opportunity to get that equipment in there.
Okay. Next, you mentioned the filtering that the buffer litter layer does. The question is, what is the maintenance required to remove the petroleum and heavy metals that may be collecting in that filtering process?
In a normal, like, residential lot, unless you really are downslope from some industrial use or very urban area, you wouldn't have any maintenance involved. In other words, the litter layer is continuously recycling itself, and as it breaks down and the contaminants are broken down by microbes in the litter layer as well as further down in the soil. If you're in the situation where you're actually accumulating these materials from upslope for whatever reason, I don't believe there's any really maintenance that you as a homeowner or a landscaper could do other than removal of that litter layer that truly got very contaminated and disposal of it off-site, which would be better than allowing that to get into the water body.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, we have a very eroded shoreline due to water levels increasing. What do you recommend doing to reinforce the actual shoreline?
Yeah, and this is one of those things where, yeah, vegetation would be great. How do you get vegetation established? Because you've got this continuous erosion. And we've found that the COIR logs, C-O-I-R logs, are very good temporary means to hold the shoreline in place while you plant shrubs and things that will reestablish that buffer layer right at the shoreline edge. So you might Google COIR logs or look to a company if you work with them for other erosion control materials. Of course, the steeper your shoreland is, the more difficult it's going to be to stabilize that. But the key is to stabilize it somehow to get the vegetation reestablished. And if you had a fairly wide area that was eroding and you could use something like an erosion control blanket, that would be another thing to look into while you plant into that and get that reestablished.
Okay. What type of mulch do you suggest in buffers?
My idea is that the mulch is going to be temporary until the plants in the buffer all grow together, and then they're going to be self-mulching if you have deciduous plants and so forth, and that you shouldn't be replacing mulch or removing litter and replacing it with mulch. So it's really the first year or so that you're going to be adding mulch. And you can use whatever you use in your normal landscape work, typically an organic earth mulch, at least in this area of the country, but I know that differs from place to place. Related to that question, we get that question a lot when we talk about rain garden installation, because mulch tends to move when you have a lot of water flow around it. And so large particles tend to work better than small particles, and heavier particles tend to work better than lighter particles. We used to recommend triple shredded bark mulch because that would kind of knit together, but we really can't even get that anymore. So at this point, we simply recommend a bark mulch, and there's nothing wrong with using pretty much wood, wood chips that are from utilities or something like that, but only if you are sure that they aren't contaminated with invasive plants in particular, because we sure don't want to be adding rhizomes or seeds of invasive plants to get started in our vegetative buffers.
Okay, that actually leads into the next question, which is, how do you safely remove invasives to plant natives on a shoreline?
That is such a huge topic that I'm going to suggest, Penny, that would be a whole nother webinar. Not that I'm trying to avoid the question, except that is not my area of expertise.
Okay, fair enough. The next question, I have a 1960s era fire pond on my property. Are wetland regulations as strict for this versus natural ponds?
Okay, I'm guessing this person isn't from New Hampshire, because I'm not quite sure what we're talking about here, but I'm guessing a fire pond is a pond that was constructed to store water to hold that water for firefighting. So I think that most of the regulations, at least in New Hampshire, would not apply to a small pond that's wholly on your own property. It primarily applies to waters that are categorized by size of the stream and water flow, and typically they're going to be your larger streams, rivers, lakes, and so forth. And a pond would not qualify as something that is covered under our Comprehensive Shoreline Protection Act, so I don't know about other states.
Okay. There was a follow-on question from this listener. Our fire pond has a variable water level changing as much as 6 vertical feet per year. How would we manage that?
No, that's a huge water level fluctuation. So again, I can't quite visualize what we are talking about or how large this pond might be. But I think that, in any situation establishing vegetative buffer, not necessarily on the shore where you're getting that fluctuation, but as a buffer getting into that pond. But you also have to, I'm sure, allow for access to that pond. So you would want to choose your access point carefully, perhaps not where most of the runoff water is coming in, but somewhere else on that, and establish some lower shrubs and things rather than maybe tall trees.
Okay. And we did have a comment from someone in Massachusetts saying that in Massachusetts, this would probably be regulated as an isolated wetland. Apparently.
Oh, the fire pond would?
And I think we just have a couple of minutes remaining. Are there any last-minute questions that anyone would like to ask Catherine? If not, I think...
Let me point out also that my email is on the screen right there. If anybody wants to email me at any time, I'd be glad to try to research some of these things that you're asking about.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. This has been extremely informative, and we have lots to think about as we vegetate and infiltrate our water's edge properties. And thank you all again for attending. Thank you, Catherine, for this great presentation. And goodbye and good gardening to you all.